My name is Claire, and for a long time I believed that love meant sacrificing my comfort for the sake of others. That's why, at 27, I agreed to move into my in-laws' house after Ethan and I got married. He told me his father, Robert, was in poor health, and it was only temporary until they could afford assisted living. The house itself was a stately old colonial on the edge of town, with ivy climbing up brick walls and an overgrown garden that always seemed to be in shadow. Ethan loved it there. He'd grown up in those creaking hallways and insisted it would be the best place to start our life together. I tried to share his optimism, telling myself that once we settled in, it would feel like home. In the beginning, it was almost nice. His mother, Helen, was polite, if a bit distant. She spent most days knitting or watching daytime television. Robert, on the other hand, was more attentive. He hovered whenever I cooked dinner or sorted the mail, always commenting on how nice it was to have a young woman in the house again. I chalked it up to harmless nostalgia, the way older people sometimes reminisce about their youth. But after a while, the comments started to feel different. He'd tell me how pretty I looked when I smiled, or how he liked the way I arranged the flowers on the dining table. Once, he reached out to brush something off my shoulder. A gesture that lingered a second too long. My skin prickled under his hand, but I smiled tightly and moved away. I didn't want to cause a scene over what might have been an innocent mistake. At night, I would lie awake next to Ethan, listening to the old house creak and groan. Sometimes I wondered if I was overreacting, if my discomfort was just the stress of adjusting to marriage and new surroundings. I didn't tell Ethan how I felt. He was already worried about his father's declining health, and I didn't want to add to his burden. So I kept my thoughts to myself, determined to make it work. It wasn't until weeks later that I realized how much of myself I was already sacrificing. Little by little, I stopped wearing anything that might draw attention. No dresses, no fitted blouses. I pulled my hair into a bun every morning because Robert once said he liked it when it fell over my shoulders. I started taking my meals in the kitchen after everyone else had eaten, just to avoid his lingering gaze. One evening, after a long day at work, I came home to find Robert sitting alone in the living room. He looked up at me, his expression unreadable. I mumbled a greeting and tried to hurry past him, but he stopped me with a question. "How was your day?" he asked, his voice low. I told him it was fine, that I was tired. He nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on me in a way that made my stomach twist. I excused myself and went straight to the bedroom, locking the door behind me for the first time since we'd moved in. My heart thudded against my ribs, and I couldn't explain why I felt so afraid. Later that night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Ethan was snoring softly beside me, blissfully unaware. I knew I should say something, that I should trust my husband with what was weighing on me. But every time I imagined the conversation, a tight knot formed in my throat. What if he thought I was exaggerating? What if he thought I was accusing his father of something unthinkable? So I stayed silent. I told myself it was only temporary, that I could handle it. But in the quiet moments, I wasn't so sure. It was a Tuesday afternoon when it happened for the first time, an incident so unsettling that even now I can feel the memory of it on my skin. Ethan had left early that morning to drive his mother to an appointment. I'd taken a half day from work, hoping for a rare moment of quiet in the house. I was in the kitchen, wiping down the counters, when I heard Robert shuffle in behind me. I didn't turn right away. My mind was occupied with small worries. Whether I'd left the iron plugged in, if I'd remembered to pay the water bill. Then I felt it. The unmistakable pressure of a hand against the small of my back. Every muscle in my body went rigid. My breath caught. For a moment, I didn't understand what was happening. I'd expected him to say something, maybe ask about dinner, but he didn't speak. He just stood there, his palm pressed firmly against me as if testing how much he could get away with. When I finally turned, his hand dropped to his side. His face was a mask of bland politeness, but his eyes stayed locked on mine. My voice cracked. I didn't know what to say. My mind searched frantically for some benign explanation. Maybe he'd lost his balance. Maybe he hadn't realized. But the look on his face told me everything I needed to know. I backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Excuse me," I whispered, though I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. I slipped past him and went straight to the bedroom, locking the door behind me. Inside, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my hands. They were trembling so badly I had to press them against my knees to steady them. 100 thoughts crowded my mind, each one more disorienting than the last. Was it an accident? Was he confused? Did he even understand what he was doing? The answer that came, quiet but unshakable, was no. He knew. I thought about calling Ethan, but the words wouldn't form. What was I supposed to say? Your father touched me in a way that felt wrong? Would he believe me? Or would he insist I'd misunderstood? A memory surfaced then. Ethan telling me, just after we married, that Robert had always been old-fashioned, that he sometimes said things that came across the wrong way. I wondered if that was what Ethan would say now, that Robert didn't mean anything by it, that he was just being affectionate in his own clumsy way. I didn't leave the bedroom for hours. When I finally emerged, the house was quiet again. Robert was nowhere to be seen. I tiptoed around as if any noise might wake something lurking in the walls. That night, I lay awake long after Ethan fell asleep. His breathing was slow and even, the same comforting rhythm I'd grown to love. But it didn't comfort me now. I was alone in this, and the realization hurt more than I could admit. The next morning, I told myself it would never happen again, that maybe he'd realized how inappropriate it was and would keep his distance. But he didn't. Instead, he grew bolder in ways so subtle I almost questioned my sanity. He began to linger near me whenever Ethan was out of the room. If I stood to leave, he'd stand too, blocking the doorway for just a heartbeat before stepping aside. His eyes always followed me, assessing, weighing something I couldn't name. Sometimes he'd make small comments that sounded innocent on the surface but carried a darker undercurrent. "You're a very lovely girl, Claire," he'd say, his gaze resting on my mouth just a fraction too long. "Ethan's lucky to have you." Each time my skin prickled with a warning I couldn't ignore. I tried to find reasons to leave the house during the day. I volunteered for extra shifts at work. I made excuses to run errands, anything to avoid being alone with him. But there were always moments I couldn't escape. Passing him in the hallway, brushing past him at the front door. And each time my heart would lurch in my chest, waiting for the next boundary he'd decide to cross. One evening, Ethan noticed how jumpy I was. He reached across the table to take my hand. "You've been so tense lately," he said gently. "Is everything okay?" The question almost broke me. This was my chance. I could tell him everything. The touches, the way Robert looked at me, the sick dread that coiled in my stomach every time I heard his footsteps. But when I opened my mouth, no words came out. Instead, I smiled weakly. "I'm just tired," I lied. "Work has been stressful." He believed me. Or maybe he wanted to. Either way, he squeezed my hand and let it go. That night, I sat alone in the bathroom, staring at my reflection. My face looked pale and strained, a stranger's face. "You can't keep pretending this is normal," I whispered to the woman in the mirror. But what was the alternative? Accuse Ethan's father of something that would shatter the fragile peace we'd built? I pressed my palms against the counter and closed my eyes. I didn't have an answer yet. All I knew was that I couldn't live like this much longer. Days passed, but the feeling in the pit of my stomach never eased. Each morning when I woke up, I felt a cold dread in my chest, wondering what Robert would say or do next. Even if he did nothing, the possibility hung over me like a cloud I couldn't shake. I started spending longer hours at work, volunteering for extra projects just to avoid coming home. When Ethan called to ask if I was all right, I'd say I had deadlines to finish or that traffic was terrible. I could hear the worry in his voice, but I still couldn't make myself tell him the truth. One Thursday evening, as I was driving back home, I finally admitted to myself that I couldn't go on like this. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and I had to pull over to steady my breathing. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might split my ribs. I closed my eyes and tried to picture what I wanted, what would make me feel safe again. The answer came to me, clear and undeniable. I needed to leave that house. If Ethan couldn't see it, I would have to make him understand. I rehearsed what I would say over and over as I drove. By the time I walked through the front door, I felt hollow with exhaustion but determined. Ethan was sitting on the sofa reading when I came in. He looked up, smiling. "You're home late again," he said. "Everything okay?" I swallowed, feeling my throat tighten. "Can we talk?" His smile faded. He set the book aside and sat up straighter. "Of course. What's wrong?" I sat across from him, gathering my courage. "I've been thinking a lot, Ethan, about us living here." He waited, silent. "I don't feel comfortable," I said finally, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I don't think I can stay here much longer. I want us to find our own place." His eyebrows lifted. "What?" "Claire, we talked about this when we moved in. My parents need help." "I know," I said quickly. "I understand that. But it's been months and I don't feel safe." My voice cracked on the last word, but I pressed on. "This house doesn't feel like home. I feel like I'm constantly walking on eggshells." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Because of my father?" I looked down at my hands. "It's everything. The way he talks to me, the way he looks at me. I'm sorry, but it's true." He rubbed his forehead and exhaled slowly. "Claire, he's old. He doesn't mean anything by it." I flinched. The dismissal in his tone felt like a slap. But I kept going. "It doesn't matter if he means it or not. It matters that it makes me feel unsafe." He stared at me for a long moment, then shook his head. "You're overreacting." The words made something go cold inside me. I felt my heart sink, heavy with disappointment. "I'm not overreacting," I whispered. "I've tried to ignore it, but I can't anymore." "Claire," he said more softly, "I know this isn't easy, but we can't just leave. They need us. My mother can't manage everything alone." I felt tears gathering, but I blinked them back. "And what about me? Do I matter in this equation at all?" His face softened. "Of course you matter. But you know how much this family means to me." I swallowed hard. I'd known he loved his parents. Of course he did. But I hadn't realized until that moment that he might never put me first. That night, I lay awake in our bed, while Ethan slept beside me, his breathing deep and even. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the creaks of the old house, every sound magnified in the darkness. I thought about how much I'd given up since we moved in. My privacy, my comfort, my sense of security, all to avoid upsetting anyone, all to protect the illusion of a happy family. But what about protecting myself? The next day, I tried to pretend nothing had changed. I went to work, came home, cooked dinner. But something in me had shifted. A small, steady voice in the back of my mind was growing louder, repeating the same thought over and over. "You can't keep living like this." The following weekend, I decided to make one last attempt to talk to Ethan. Maybe if he saw how serious I was, he would finally understand. I found him in the backyard, trimming the overgrown hedges. He looked up when I stepped outside, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Hey." I took a deep breath. "I need you to listen to me. Really listen." He set down the clippers. "Okay." "I'm not okay," I said. My voice was shaking. "I don't feel safe here. I don't feel respected. And if something doesn't change, I don't know how much longer I can do this." He looked away, his jaw working. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying," I said, forcing my voice to steady, "that I want to move out, with or without you." His gaze snapped back to mine. For a moment he looked like he might argue, but then he just sighed. "Claire, please, give it more time." I felt something inside me break. The last sliver of hope that he would fight for me, that he would put my well-being above everything else. "I've already given it too much time," I said quietly. I turned and walked back inside, leaving him standing there among the hedges. That evening, I began to plan. I didn't know when I would leave, but I knew it was no longer a question of if. It was only a matter of time. And for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of relief. I spent the next week moving through the house as if it were a stranger's. Every corner felt haunted by the quiet knowledge that I didn't belong there. Each morning, I woke up and counted the hours until I could leave for work, where the walls didn't watch me, where no one brushed against me when Ethan wasn't looking. I tried to keep my distance, to stay out of Robert's path. If I heard him coming down the hallway, I would duck into the bathroom or step outside to water the wilting plants. But avoiding him was like trying to avoid the wind. He was always there, somehow drifting into whatever room I was in. One evening, Ethan left to pick up takeout. I was alone in the kitchen, sorting through the mail with my heart already hammering in my chest. The sound of Robert's uneven footsteps behind me made my stomach twist. I didn't turn around. I kept my eyes fixed on the envelopes in my hand, pretending I hadn't noticed him. I hoped that if I stayed still enough, he would go away. He didn't. He stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the heat of his body against my back. My breath caught, but I forced myself not to move. Not yet. Then, without a word, he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. His hand lingered against my cheek, tracing the line of my jaw. It was such an intimate gesture that for a split second, my mind went blank. I felt frozen to the floor, my heart roaring in my ears. When my voice came back to me, it was thin and strangled. "Don't." His hand didn't move. I felt something inside me snap. I spun around so fast that the pile of mail scattered across the floor. "Don't touch me." My voice came out louder than I'd ever heard it in that house. He looked at me with a blank expression, as though I were the one behaving strangely. "I was just being friendly," he said, his voice soft, almost patronizing. I shook my head, backing away until I hit the counter. My hands were trembling so badly I had to grip the edge to steady them. "That wasn't friendly," I whispered. For a moment he just watched me, his gaze cold and assessing. Then he turned and walked out of the kitchen as though nothing had happened. I slid down the cabinet to the floor, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I felt like I'd just run a mile. My skin crawled where he'd touched me, and no matter how many times I wiped my cheek with my sleeve, I couldn't erase the sensation. When Ethan came home with dinner, he found me still sitting there, the mail scattered around me. He looked puzzled, then concerned. "Claire, what happened?" I wanted to tell him. Every instinct screamed to tell him, but I didn't trust my voice to hold steady. So I shook my head, stood up, and went to the bedroom without a word. I locked the door behind me and pressed my forehead against the wood. My whole body was shaking with something that felt like both terror and rage. That was the moment I knew. I couldn't wait for Ethan to choose me. I couldn't wait for anyone to save me. If I didn't leave, it would keep happening. And eventually, I would stop believing it was wrong. The next morning, I woke up before dawn. The house was still and dark. I lay there for a long time, listening to Ethan's breathing. My heart hurt in a way I couldn't describe. I loved him, but love wasn't going to protect me. When the sun rose, I quietly got out of bed and began packing a suitcase. I moved like someone in a dream, folding clothes, slipping my toiletries into a bag, setting aside the things I'd need right away. Halfway through, I stopped and looked around the room. The wedding photos on the dresser, the framed picture of us at the lake, the little ceramic bowl Ethan had given me for my earrings. I pressed a hand to my chest, fighting the swell of grief that rose in my throat. This wasn't how it was supposed to be, but it was the only way it could be. When I zipped the suitcase closed, it felt like closing a chapter of my life. I sat on the edge of the bed and waited. I didn't know if Ethan would wake up before I left, if he would try to stop me. Part of me hoped he would, because then, at least he'd be forced to see how serious this was. But he didn't stir. I carried my suitcase down the hallway. Every step felt like it echoed off the walls. When I passed Robert's door, I felt my stomach twist again. I didn't look inside. I didn't want to see his face. When I reached the front door, I set the suitcase down and took one last look around the house. This was the place I'd tried to call home. The place where I'd told myself over and over that I could make it work. If only I tried a little harder. But the truth was, no amount of effort would ever make me safe here. I picked up my suitcase and walked out the door. I didn't look back. I didn't go far at first. My sister Emily lived across town, and though I hadn't told her much about what was happening, she'd always said her guest room was mine if I ever needed it. I texted her from the car, "I'm coming over. I can't explain everything yet." Her reply was instant, "Whatever you need. I'll put on coffee." As I drove, the adrenaline that had carried me out of that house began to fade, replaced by a cold, aching exhaustion. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely keep them on the wheel. Part of me was terrified Ethan would call, that he'd demand to know where I'd gone. Part of me was terrified that he wouldn't call at all. When I pulled up in front of Emily's house, she was already on the porch waiting for me. One look at my face and she didn't ask questions. She just hugged me so tightly I could finally let out a shaky breath. "I'm here," she whispered. "You're safe now." The moment she said it, my composure crumbled. The tears came fast and hot, unstoppable. I hadn't cried in front of anyone for months. I hadn't let myself feel how scared I'd been. That night, after I'd showered and changed into clean clothes, I sat on Emily's couch with a cup of tea cooling in my hands. I tried to put the past months into words. How the uneasy feeling had turned into outright fear, how I'd tried so hard to be understanding, to be patient, to protect Ethan's feelings even as I felt myself breaking. Emily listened without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at me, her jaw tight with anger I hadn't expected. "You know this isn't your fault, right?" she said quietly. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed it yet. The next morning, Ethan called. When I saw his name on my phone, my stomach lurched. My first instinct was to ignore it, to let it go to voicemail. But I knew I couldn't avoid this conversation forever. I stepped onto the porch, shutting the door behind me, and answered. "Claire." His voice sounded strained. "Where are you?" "I'm at Emily's." There was a long pause. "I came home and you were gone. You didn't leave a note." I closed my eyes. I couldn't stay there anymore. Another silence, heavier this time. Because of my father. Yes. My voice shook, but I didn't let it stop me. Because of him, and because you wouldn't believe me. He exhaled a ragged breath. "Claire, he's old. He's sick. He doesn't always know what he's doing." The words hit me like a slap. Even after everything, he was still making excuses. "Ethan," I said carefully. "He knew exactly what he was doing. And you knew too. His voice rose, tight with frustration. What was I supposed to do? Put him in a home? Abandon my parents? He can't help it. You were supposed to protect me, I said. My throat felt raw. You were supposed to take me seriously when I told you I didn't feel safe. I did take you seriously, he insisted, but you were overreacting. I felt something inside me go cold and hard. Don't say that. God, Claire, I thought you'd try harder to understand. He's losing his mind. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. I did try to understand. For months, while he touched me without my consent, while you told me it was nothing. He didn't respond. I took a shaky breath. I'm not coming back. There was another long silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was small. You're really going to end our marriage over this? The question made my heart twist, but I forced myself to answer honestly. I'm ending it because you let it happen, because you called it senility and expected me to just live with it. I thought back to all the times I'd looked to Ethan for help and found nothing but polite denial. All the nights I'd lain awake wondering if maybe I was overreacting. But I wasn't. I deserved better. When I hung up, I sat on the porch steps, staring at the street. My hands were shaking, but I felt a strange sense of clarity settling over me, like I'd finally stepped out of a fog I hadn't realized I was in. Emily came outside and sat next to me without saying a word. After a while, she slipped her hand into mine. You did the right thing, she said softly. I nodded, blinking back tears. I know. For the first time in a long time, I really did. Later that day, I began gathering the documents I would need for the divorce. Utility bills, bank statements, copies of my marriage certificate. The practical tasks felt surreal, like I was helping someone else end their marriage. Ethan tried calling twice more that evening. I didn't pick up. There was nothing left to say. When I lay down in Emily's guest room that night, the silence felt different. Not the suffocating silence of the old house, but a clean, empty quiet. A space where I could finally hear myself think. I realized I hadn't felt safe in months. I hadn't felt like myself in months. And maybe it would take a long time to heal. But at least now, healing was finally possible. In the days that followed, everything moved both too quickly and unbearably slow. One morning, I woke up before dawn in Emily's guest room. The sky outside was still dark, the first hint of sunrise blurring the line between night and day. I lay there, listening to the quiet, the unfamiliar creaks of her house, the hum of traffic 2 streets away. For a few moments, I felt weightless, unanchored. Then reality settled in again, what I had left behind, what I was about to do. I got up and made coffee. I sat at Emily's kitchen table and opened my laptop. I didn't let myself think too long before typing, family law attorney near me. My finger hovered over the search button. Even after everything, there was a voice in my head that whispered, maybe you're overreacting. Maybe you should give him another chance. But I closed my eyes and thought of Robert's hand on my cheek, the look in Ethan's eyes when he called me dramatic, and the way my own voice had sounded when I finally said, I'm not coming back. That was all the clarity I needed. I pressed search. That week, I met with a lawyer named Ms. Holloway. She was brisk and kind, with silver hair and a no-nonsense voice that steadied me when my own words trembled. She asked me why I was filing for divorce. I hesitated, but then I told her the truth. Every detail I'd kept secret for so long. She didn't look shocked. She didn't look like she thought I was exaggerating. She just nodded and took notes. When I finished, she looked me in the eye and said, You're not the first woman I've met who stayed too long because she was afraid of being disbelieved. You did the right thing leaving. Hearing that from a stranger made something uncoil inside me. A knot I hadn't realized was there. I wish I could say Ethan accepted my decision gracefully, but he didn't. He called again and again, leaving messages that swung between pleading and anger. Please, can't we just talk about this? You're blowing everything out of proportion. My dad is sick, Claire. He can't help it. You're throwing away our marriage. Each voicemail chipped at the edges of my resolve. But I didn't answer. I knew if I heard his voice live, part of me might cave. I needed distance. I needed to save myself. The day the papers were delivered to Ethan, he called one last time. This time, I answered. I knew I had to. His voice was raw, almost hoarse. I never thought you'd really go through with this. I swallowed, my throat tight. I know. Do you still love me? It was a question I'd asked myself so many nights, lying in that house, trying to convince myself that love was enough. Yes, I said quietly. But love isn't supposed to hurt like this. It isn't supposed to make you feel like you're the only one protecting yourself. He was silent so long I thought he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded older than I'd ever heard it. I'm sorry. I know, I whispered. And then I ended the call. The divorce wasn't easy. I had to answer questions I didn't want to answer, relive moments I wished I could erase. There were days I second-guessed everything. Days I missed Ethan so badly I felt like I couldn't breathe. But there were also moments, small ones at first, when I felt free. The first morning, I woke up and realized I didn't have to brace myself to walk down a hallway. The first afternoon, I made lunch without glancing over my shoulder. The first evening, I laughed at something on TV and didn't immediately feel guilty. Little by little, I started to remember who I was before I lost myself trying to keep everyone else comfortable. 3 months later, the divorce was finalized. I moved into a small apartment with bright windows and a lock on the door that I alone controlled. My sister helped me unpack, and when she left that first night, I sat on the floor surrounded by half-empty boxes, feeling both hollowed out and oddly peaceful. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was a life that belonged only to me. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma and boundaries. At first, I thought I would only go a few times, but I found myself looking forward to those sessions. I learned to name what had happened to me, to say the words sexual harassment without flinching, to understand that I hadn't overreacted. I had reacted exactly as someone should when they are being harmed. One evening, months later, I was sitting on my balcony watching the sunset behind the buildings. The sky was streaked with pink and gold. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I hope you're okay. No name, but I knew it was Ethan. I read the message twice. Then I turned off my phone and set it aside. I didn't reply. If you are watching this and you've ever felt trapped, like your safety and peace were less important than someone else's excuses, please hear me when I say this. You are allowed to leave. You are allowed to start over. You are allowed to put yourself first. It doesn't make you weak. It doesn't make you selfish. It makes you brave. This is my story. Not the one I thought I would be telling when I first said I do. But it's the story that taught me I am stronger than I ever knew. And if you're here because you're living something similar, I promise you, there is life beyond this. There is hope. There is freedom. And you deserve every bit of it.